Sometimes the struggle to start the thing is even harder than the struggle to complete the thing. Welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where every week I talk through an item on a list made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. This week we're circling back to the making category after kind of a longish hiatus to talk through number 28, choose doing over stewing. The reality is that in my own personal process of making or creating or writing, actually getting down to business and doing the work is almost always less painful than brooding over or resisting or dreading that work. Doing over stewing makes for greater productivity, obviously, but also, and way more importantly, I think it makes for a happier, more satisfying, and ultimately much less stressful life. And if that sounds obvious, it's probably because it is. Um, I think I've known this on some level forever and probably picked this up in elementary school with regard to academic work. How long has it taken me to master doing overstewing? Well, I'll let you know when it happens because it hasn't actually happened yet. For whatever reason, I have to relearn this about 6 or 8 or 10 times a month, it seems, even now. And I think probably some people do master this early on, but I haven't. And as a consequence, I'm perpetually being reschooled in this principle. And I find it frustrating that this is still so difficult for me because I intimately understand this process and I completely accept its outcomes, which is to say that I know when I'm not doing work that needs or wants to be done. I am also not in any way, shape, or form actually enjoying the time that I'm using to not do the work. So it's not like I am stealing away a few hours from an important project and then I'm blissfully running through a field of flowers with my mind clear and my heart untroubled with that time. Because when I'm in the process of actively avoiding important work, I'm not doing anything good with the energy I'm withholding from the doing. I'm actually almost always directing that energy back to fretting about the work and not doing it. And it's miserable. And it's worse than just doing the thing in the first place. So eventually, every time, and usually it's when a looming deadline makes it impossible to continue limping along in a guilt ridden, unproductive state, I finally do the work. And sometimes doing the work does suck exactly as much as I feared it would. And sometimes it's not that bad. And I would even say that there are moments when it turns out to be rewarding, when flow steps in and helps me out with momentum and focus, and sometimes even real joy in the act of creating and working and doing. And honestly, no matter how good or bad the actual experience of doing the work is, having done the work is always a kind of bliss. It's a huge relief. It's a great feeling. And that's true even if the work, this draft or this version, has turned out to be pure shit. And I think that's a really important point. In most cases, it doesn't have to be great work, at least not right now. It counts that it's just work that is done and that the overall project has been pushed closer to done, right? There's a great TED talk that's floating around by Elizabeth Gilbert that gets right at this particular point. And I'll look for it and I'll try to put the specifics in the show notes for this episode. Anyway, Elizabeth Gilbert's a writer. I think she's probably best known for Eat, Pray, Love, which was a memoir that blew up several years ago into a big film adaptation. I think it starred Julia Roberts, if I'm remembering correctly. But anyway, in this TED Talk, she's talking explicitly to writers about creative work, but I think it's all pretty broadly applicable to all kinds of work and all kinds of doing. She basically argues that you're responsible for showing up at your workspace and putting your ass in the chair and doing something, and giving it a go, making a try at whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing. And maybe something amazing will come of that. Maybe if you're in the right place at the right time and the fates are kind, and the stars align, then maybe the universe will show up and meet you in that place of work with a flash of inspiration or divine energy or just pure dumb luck and help you make that work really great. Or maybe, perhaps more likely, the universe will just be, taking a nap that particular day and everything you do will feel incredibly human and subpar. But that's not really your problem, according to Elizabeth Gilbert, because you did your part on this particular day, and now you can go have a cookie or take a nap unburdened by regret because you know that you gave it a go. You did the work. And I think that even if you don't subscribe to any mystical hoo ha, there's something freeing in taking the pressure to be transcendent off your own shoulders. You just have to do the work to the best of your ability on any given day. Because however it turns out, whether it's good or bad, or transcendent or painfully ordinary, it's still better than another day spent lying in the carpet, gnashing your teeth, and agonizing about not doing the work. And this is probably more applicable to creative work because often, though not always, creative work has fewer external deadlines. You can always come back the next day and give it another go. And sometimes at work, we have to get things done day of. But I do think we can generally apply this principle to all kinds of work. And I think it's really important in the milieu of modern work, where most of us are capable of working from, or at least continuing to work from home. And there are fewer clear firewalls between the workday and personal time. I think we need to get ourselves to a place psychologically where we feel like we've put in our time and effort that day and we're morally justified in disconnecting from the workplace and that set of tasks and kind of returning to our own interests and our own needs. And I think that's just easier to do when you're not dragging around a lot of guilt. And I think there's just less guilt generated by a day of doing instead of stewing. At least there is for me. Maybe it's good to think about a more expansive definition of stewing too. For me, it starts with avoidance and procrastination, that kind of writhing around on the mental carpet, putting off stuff you know you should or want to or must eventually do. I think it's feeling oppressed by that eventuality. And sometimes I think it looks like putting off engagement with an obligation entirely. But I do think stewing has some pretty unhelpful close cousins that do involve some level of engagement with the work. But it's engagement that isn't really moving the ball down the field in a way that feels productive or generative. And I'm thinking first of extensive, excessive planning to do the work. And I'm not complaining about planning. I think some solid planning at the start of a task can almost always save you time and effort and strife and trouble. But I think you probably know what I'm talking about because I think we all do it to some extent. It's when we're planning out our third alternative approach, or maybe we're rewriting the task list in calligraphy just because. Sometimes I know I've gone around the bend with planning when I find myself color coding things. I tend to slip into this kind of planning, and I feel like it's more like sitting in a storage closet than it is sitting in a waiting room, if that makes any sense functionally. It has become a thing in itself rather than a ramp up to the thing itself. And I can sometimes fool myself into thinking I'm spending time productively planning, only to realize later that it was just a lot of wheel spinning. And then I'm back to guilt and fretting. I think another similar thing I do is to immerse myself in research that's far out of proportion to the actual scope of research I need to do this work in an informed and grounded way. And like with planning, I am pro research. I'm an academic by training. I have an early background in social science research. So I believe in it. And I think it's a key to making decisions that are informed by lived experience. And I think research prevents us from reinventing the wheel constantly. But I can get stuck in it in much the same way that I can get stuck in planning mode. And instead of it being a thing that propels me forward into the work itself, excessive research can just become the mud I'm stuck in. So I try to be aware of that too. And finally, sometimes I burn off a lot of creative energy just by talking about the thing I need or want to do or make. And I think this is actually pretty common with creative work. We love the idea of the work, but are sometimes afraid of or intimidated by or even just worn out by the doing itself. I think this takes us back sometimes to that gap between our idea and our execution, which we talked about all the way back in the first episode of this podcast. It's less work and more rewarding in some ways to talk about this perfect idea for a project than to actually dive in and wrestle an imperfect draft or version of that thing into reality. And even for people who are advanced practitioners of whatever art they may be doing, discussing and describing a project is just sexier in some ways than doing one. I can remember a study that showed that talking about a project actually burns off some of the exact kind of energy that it takes to do the project. So if you talk about something all the time, instead of getting amped up about it, you're actually siphoning off some of the creative energy that you would need to do it. And so you become less likely to do it. And I wish I could remember exactly where I did read that because I'd share it. But I know I did read it and I remember it very vividly because it actually inspired my best friend and I to declare and enact this thing we called the embargo. This has probably been a dozen years ago, or maybe more, but we both had ideas for projects that we really wanted to work on, but we never worked on them. We just talked constantly to each other about these great ideas and how much we wanted to act on them and how much we wished we had time for them, but we just didn't tackle them. Then one or the other of us, don't remember which, found this article about dissipating creative energy by talking. And we decided that we were going to go an entire summer without talking about our dream projects. Boom, the embargo was born. And at the end of that summer, we had both done so much more actual work on those projects in 3 months than we had in probably the previous 3 years. And to this day, we tend to talk less about what we're working on. Neither of us are getting everything we want to do done. And yeah, we still yammer a lot about ideas and projects. But to this very day, I think we're a lot more mindful about not blathering away all our energies by talking again and again about these things that we'd like to do. So I guess I have gotten better at doing overstewing year over year. But unfortunately, it is still a lesson that I'm constantly relearning. I still have to give myself a shake when I catch myself procrastinating or avoiding. I still have to remind myself that this stolen time is lost time because I'm not actually enjoying it or relaxing in it. And I still have to consciously put my ass back in the chair and do my part of the work for that day almost every day. And that gets tiring, but at least I know how, at this stage of my life, to redirect to the doing instead of getting hopelessly locked in hours of stewing. Okay, so that's about enough of that for now. I hope the rest of your day is spent doing whatever you most need or want to do with very little stewing involved. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I'll be back next week with thing number 29.